Shea's team scored a few runs, but they were still behind by 3. In the bottom of the 9th inning, Shea's team scored again. And now, with 2 outs and the bases loaded, Shea was scheduled to be at bat. I didn't think that the team would actually let him bat at this juncture when they really had a good chance to win. Shea didn't even know how to hold the bat properly, let alone hit with it. However, as Shea stepped up to the plate, the pitcher moved a few steps to lob the ball in softly, so Shea could at least be able to make contact. The first pitch came, and Shea missed. A teammate came up to Shea, and together they held the bat, and when the next pitch came in, they hit a slow ground ball right to the pitcher, who could have easily scooped it up and thrown it to the first baseman, and that would have been the end of the game. Instead, the pitcher took the ball, and he threw it on a high arc to the right field beyond the reach of the first baseman. So everyone started yelling, "Shea, run to first! Run to first!" Never in his life had Shea done this, but he scampered down the baseline, wide-eyed and startled. By the time he reached first base, the right fielder had the ball. He could have thrown it to the second baseman, who would have tagged Shea out because that's where he was running now. But the right fielder understood what the pitcher's intentions were. So he threw the ball high and far over the third baseman's head, and everyone yelled, "Run to second, Shea! Run to second!" As the base runners circled the bases towards home, the opposing shortstop ran to Shea, turned him in the direction of third base, and shouted to him, "Now run to third, Shea." Shea rounded third, and the boys from both teams ran behind him screaming, "Shea, run home! Shea, run home! Shea, run home!" And as he stepped on home plate, all 18 boys lifted him up on their shoulders, and they made him the hero as he had just hit a grand slam. I know there are tears running down my face, but I want to tell you that those 18 boys were mediators of the sacred. It was a day of divine grace. Someone said, God doesn't call the qualified, God qualifies the called. For me, the times I most experience God and God's direction and presence is when I go to the women's prison in Niantic, where I've been a volunteer chaplain since 1995. I try to remember on the way down to pray that I will be helpful to whomever I meet. So many times, instead of seeing the inmates I've planned to see, they're not available, and I find myself being directed to women who have been desperately praying for someone to talk to. And if I don't find them, they find me. I'd like to read to you something written by an inmate I met at a very low period in her incarceration. It comes from a book that the inmates wrote called Acts of Faith. She called this Believing. I have been sentenced to 37 years, and I was in an emotional, spiritual, and mental turmoil. In the days that followed, I considered suicide many times. I was on a destructive rampage. I was doing all that I could to keep a level head, but my world was falling apart. All this led me to being put in solitary confinement under administrative detention, and I was put in restraints, awaiting a hearing to be classified. I was locked in a room with a hole in the door to receive food and whatever else I needed. My self-esteem was at the lowest point. God sent me Pastor Lorraine. She began to visit me. She brought a Bible, paper, and pen, and she told me that if I cared, my healing process could begin by writing my story. Pastor Lorraine started coming twice a week, and she'd always give me a new book to read and ask me how my writing was coming along. I learned that anything is possible with faith in God and in yourself. Similar to thin places, there are things called synchronistic events. And they're almost similar to thin places, which we said where two levels of reality meet or intersect. Carl Jung, the famous psychotherapist, was the one that came up with this word, synchronicity. And he used it to describe two simultaneous occurrences which are meaningful but not connected. He maintained that these are not accidents or chance happenings or mere coincidences. Whether invited or not, God is present. I'd like to share with you, if I have time, two events that happened to me that were synchronistic. I can't tell you just when I went from being a moderate drinker to a heavy drinker, but by the early 80s, I was drinking a lot. I had given up on serving on committees that met at night because they interfered with my drinking time. And I didn't want to go anywhere, so I didn't have access to alcohol. In 1983, however, I met someone that I was really fond of. And in a year's time, we became good friends. She was enough of a friend to tell me that when I drank, she didn't know who I was. But if I wanted to, she'd introduce me to her psychiatrist, who she knew could help me. I agreed. And so my appointment was for 9:30 on a Saturday morning in August. I was in that office at 9:30, and the clock ticked to 9:35, and then to 9:40, and then to 9:45, and by 9:50 the door finally opened. And Dr. Toll introduced herself, and she said, "You are not to worry. I will make up the time with you." She was a Russian. And I figured, well, we'll see how this goes. So we went into her office and sat down, and she said to me, "And what can I do for you?" And I figured, oh, I'm going to fudge this. And I said, "I think I'm an alcoholic." And she says, "Oh, we will take care of that." And that she did. When I went home, I didn't go home. I went to my cottage right after that session. And I had this clock up on the wall that was battery operated. And it had stopped. And I said to my friend, "Gee, look at my clock stopped." And she says, "Yeah, isn't that the time you went in to see Nina?" And I says, "Yeah, 10 of 10, imagine that." I said, "Well, I'm not going to bother changing that clock. I never even look at it anyways." 2 years later, Nina died. I had 2 years of sobriety. I went to her wake. I think I was the only one crying my eyes out. I went to her wake, and when it was over, I went back to my cottage again. And the clock had started again. I often referred to Dr. Toll as my spiritual grandmother, because in her I experienced the presence of God. And that synchronistic event made me realize how God was there for me at a very critical juncture in my life. The other synchronistic event I had was when I moved next door to my mother in